to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock. Now, Brisbane's property market has been making headlines, and with the 2032 Olympics on the horizon, it's about to get even more interesting. In this episode of the Geared for Growth podcast, I sit down with Melinda Jennison, one of Brisbane's most respected property experts, to unpack the fundamentals driving the market right now. We dive into the economic demographics and lifestyle factors fueling demand, the Olympic-related infrastructure projects that could reshape the city, and why Brisbane is standing out compared to Sydney and Melbourne. If you want to understand where Brisbane's market is heading and what opportunities lie ahead for investors, then this episode is for you. Let's jump in. I am your host, Mike Mortlock, Managing Director of MCG Quantity Surveyors. And why this event? Well, our clients are predominantly investors and we want them to win. So we have to put them in front of the information that helps to give them the best chance to outperform the general property market and hopefully set themselves up for a grand financial future. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce today Melinda Jennison, or, honestly, if I had a resume, I'd probably call myself Dr. Melinda Jennison, because she does have a PhD. And I think that you will see in the effort and the detail she's put in the slides today that come to the fore. She's the founder of Streamline Property Buyers in Brisbane. She's the president of REBA, the Real Estate Buyers Agents Association. Melinda, thanks for joining us.
Mike, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction. And I am looking forward to sharing lots of insights today about what's been happening in Brisbane, what's happening right now, but more importantly, and I think this is what most people want to know and understand, what's likely to happen in the future. And I'm certainly not going to crystal ball the market as such, but we'll run through some information that's going to provide some background data on the fundamentals, what's happening in terms of supply and demand at a local level, not just in Brisbane, but in each local government area within Brisbane. So hopefully attendees today will get some real value.
Yeah, awesome. I already know they will, because I've had a peek behind the curtain and had a look at some of those slides, of course. So for anyone that's just joined us, I'd love to hear where you're from, what your interest is in the Brisbane property market. Are you a buyer's agent? Are you an economist? Are you an investor that's just looking for the next investment property? Chuck that in the chat at your leisure, and feel free to put any questions in along the way. Melinda's obviously got some set content to go through, but we want this to be as interactive as possible. Now, Melinda, we might go straight into the slides if you want to fire that one up.
Absolutely. I think I can do this.
See how you go. Otherwise, I'll take over.
I think you can take over because it's not working at my end. So there you go.
Okay, there you go. This wouldn't be a webinar without that sort of stuff happening. Now, this is a tiny little screen for me. Let's see, where are we? Okay. So obviously, a lot of people have been talking about the Olympics. That's something that we're going to cover. Mm-hmm. And, Brisbane has been one of those markets that I really kind of thought, 23, 24 performed so strongly that it must be reaching the peak. It must sort of be running out of steam at some point. However, there's no sign of that happening at the moment. But anyway, we're fired up, ready to go. So I'll hand over to you and just let me know when you want the next one.
No, that's perfect. Thanks again, Mike. And as I've pointed out, I really want to just cover some of the fundamentals today. What's behind the most recent market surge in Brisbane? What's behind that future growth? And feel free to go to that next slide, Mike. What is behind that recent growth performance? And a lot of people who may be living in other parts of Australia, perhaps Sydney and Melbourne, we find a lot of our clients are coming from those two states. They're applying principles that are relevant to those markets, to Brisbane, and actually that's quite flawed. And I want to really help people understand why that is the case in today's presentation as well, because the fundamentals here in Southeast Queensland and in Brisbane, but even more so in certain segments of the Brisbane market, are really different to other markets around Australia. So let's look at the next slide, which will introduce the first part of those fundamentals. So housing supply really is the balance between what is available to buy, what is available for people to live in, and on the other side, what is the demand like for that particular product type? They're the fundamentals that we're always looking at when we're assessing the performance of any property market. So for the first part of this webinar, I'm going to focus on supply, and we're going to look at the immediate supply. That's short term. Now, immediate supply is typically what's available to buy today, what is in the market that is newly listed or that maybe have been sitting on the market for a few months. This is total supply, and this gives us an indication of the market depth. We're then going to look a little bit more at long-term supply, which is construction volumes, to see what is coming before we're then going to look at the demand side drivers. So let's start with short-term supply. Next slide, Mike. This is the story that's really been driving a lot of Brisbane's price pressure or price growth over recent years. Now, what we've highlighted here, this is the total number of property listings available in Brisbane long term. You can see in that long term period up to about 2021, we averaged around 28,000 to 32,000 listings per month. That meant buyers had that many properties available to choose from. Right now in Brisbane, as at July, the total number of properties that are available for sale is 15,659 listings. That's the total volume of listings. And of those, only 6,790 were new listings throughout the month of July. So the supply of properties available for sale has shrunk. We're at about 30 to 35% below our long-term average. Now, remember, this is at a time where we've seen those prices escalate because demand has been heightened, and we're going to be talking about those demand drivers. Now, what makes Brisbane different? If we can go to the next slide, I've just taken a snip of some of the listing volumes of other national or capital city markets around Australia. So you can see there on the left, this is Melbourne. You can see that the total volume of properties available for sale today is trending in line with the long-term average. So buyers still have about the same choice that they did perhaps 10 years ago. The same is true for Sydney. You can see there that if you were to draw a line of best fit across this data, it would be relatively flat, which means the number of options that buyers have to choose from is stable. If we go to the next slide, we can see that we've got two other capital city markets, Hobart and Canberra. Again, trend lines actually show perhaps an alignment with what may have happened to property values at certain historical points in time as well. So you can see there with Hobart how supply really did shrink. And I can't see the years there because my eyes aren't seeing that. But I think it's around COVID time. And then we saw the supply or the listing volumes start to increase again off the back of that. So as buyers have seen more choice coming back into the market, in a market where the demand has remained relatively stable, when you've got more supply or more listings, you're generally going to see that price pressure ease, and then you're going to see prices come off a little bit. And we've certainly seen that in Hobart in the last couple of years. Canberra, you can see that there's still plenty of choice for buyers in Canberra. Now, interestingly, when we look at the last 18 months of property market performance across all capital city markets, if we go to the next slide, we know for a fact that Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth have been the three markets that have outperformed when we're looking at that 12 or 18-month price growth. And look at the change in property listing data across these capital city markets. We've already seen Brisbane. Adelaide shows a really similar trend to Brisbane in that supply shrunk post-COVID, but it really hasn't recovered. You can see there in Perth came right down in terms of the listing volumes. And just in recent months, we have seen a general trend upward. That has reversed over the last 3 or 4 months. So that's something that we're watching to determine what's likely to happen in the future. And of course, Darwin is a very recent story. If we look at the last slide there, I think we've got Darwin's supply in terms of listing volumes has been shrinking just recently. And of course, we've seen Darwin's property prices escalate quite rapidly just in the last quarter, especially, but absolutely in the last 6 months. So when we're looking at property data, we can often, get an understanding of some of those fundamental drivers based on what is available for sale. Now, remember, anything on SQM research, which is where this data has been taken from, these are the properties that come to the market that are listed for sale. And we do know that there are a certain volume of properties that will transact off market. They're not captured by listing volumes. So we are certainly seeing some properties sell off market. But remember, in Brisbane right now, we're in a very vibrant market. There's so much demand. And what that means is for a property to transact quietly or off market, there's one or two situations in play. Firstly, it means that the buyer is offered a price that the seller is not willing to pass off. So, for example, the buyer's convinced the seller that they're not going to get a better price by listing on market. So that is an instance where it may be an inflated price, not always, but sometimes. The second instance is where a seller may actually choose to list their property privately simply because they don't want the neighbours walking through their home. Perhaps there's a divorce or perhaps there's a reason, sickness or an illness in the family as to why they actually need to let that property go quietly and quickly. And there's potential opportunity in that segment of the market. That said, the volume of off-market transactions is certainly not the gap between the volume that we've seen historically in terms of total listings and where listings currently sit. So there's definitely been fewer properties coming to the market.
Is it fair to say that in an appreciating market, the off-market transactions would shrink? Because if you're wanting to maximise your value, you kind of need it to be out there. You kind of need, eyeballs on it. You need competition, right? So I've heard quite a lot of off-market in Darwin in the last little while. That's been a market that has been quite soft, and we're now kind of seeing maybe a result of that flurry of off-market activity. But Brisbane would be still pretty modest in terms of off-market because the market's doing so well.
Yeah, and again, generally speaking, when we're talking about Brisbane, if we're looking at Cotality data, for example, that includes all of Greater Brisbane, which is over 10,000 square kilometres of geographical land. What might be happening in the inner city precincts within 10 kilometres of the CBD might actually be very different to what might be happening between Ipswich and Toowoomba in rural areas. So it's really important for property buyers and analysts not to get caught up in big market trends, but really dive deeper to understand what may be happening in certain micro markets within a capital city market as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when you first I think you made the inquiry to CoreLogic to say, what is the Brisbane LGA?
Yeah.
And it was a lot bigger than I think anyone really understood.
Absolutely. So, today we're going to be talking about the Brisbane local government area, Ipswich, Logan, Redlands, and also Moreton Bay. And most people think of this as the Greater Brisbane area. However, the Cotality data, which formerly was CoreLogic, it also captures some of the surrounding regions outside of that core area. So it's really important for people to understand that. Data is only as good as what it's made up of. So we, as on-the-ground buyers agents and property investment advisors, really prefer to get a snapshot view of what the data is telling us, but understand what we're seeing on the ground and what the supply and demand metrics are at a local level, because this helps us to understand which direction a local market might be moving. Okay, so let's look at long-term supply. And this obviously relates to the ability for us as a population group to bring more housing to the market through construction. There's a couple of things that I will say before we sort of run through some of this data. So first of all, the latest Housing Accord updates do highlight significant underperformance. So we know that nationally there's only been 134,000 or so dwellings commenced in the first 9 months of this period, compared to a target of 180,000. So it's creating a shortfall already of over 45,000 dwellings. But in Queensland, we are 29.4% behind our cumulative completion target. So despite the fact that the federal government has set in place these big targets to build more housing, we've already fallen short. And there might be some reasons for that, which I'm going to unpack in a couple of these slides. If we look at the first slide that I'd like to run through here, it talks to the cost to bring house and land to the market. And we're literally looking at a 5-year comparison period. So what we have here is the dark bar is what was happening in January 2020, and the green bar is December 2023. So this is the rising cost of new builds in greenfield house and land packages. So think big land subdivision estates being subdivided up and brand new house and land packages being built on these sites. So right now, the average cost for Brisbane to bring a greenfield house and land package to the market is $830,000. Just 5 years ago, that was $500,000. So we are up $330,000 just in the cost of house and land construction in the last 5 years, which is huge. You can see in some other capital city markets, it's an even bigger challenge. But of course, the focus on today's webinar is Brisbane. So of course, this presents as a supply issue because this creates affordability constraints when just 5 years ago, it was so much cheaper to actually purchase a block of land and build a brand new dwelling. We need to ensure that the end purchaser has the capability and the capacity to continue to pay much higher prices for this brand new product. Otherwise, it just doesn't get built. So that's probably one of the first challenges that we have with long-term supply. If we go to the next slide, this is a really interesting one because despite the fact that the federal government here in Australia is really promoting the construction of more dwellings, I really want to draw everyone's attention to the taxation changes on new homes. And we've got two graphs here. One shows the regulatory costs, taxation costs, and infrastructure charges. So these are taxes, I guess you could call them, at every level of government that contribute towards the cost of construction that the end consumer ultimately needs to pay for in the purchase price. So there's such high taxation that you can see there. Brisbane buyers face taxes and charges of up to $348,000 on greenfield homes. And that's up from $169,000 in 2019, a 106% increase in the cost of that new price that a purchaser is paying that goes straight back to various government levels. So whilst the government are incentivising or wanting people to build more home, they're actually profiting from this themselves. And in fact, their margins have increased a lot more over the last 5 or 6 years. When we look at the attached housing market, so this is for infill apartments, looking at the same cost from government, it's approximately $256,000 that goes towards government charges. Yep, that's the one. Government charges and taxes right now compared to $152,000 back in 2019. So that's an increase of 68% as well. These are big changes, and this is one of the reasons why developers are finding it increasingly difficult to bring product to the market that's at a price point that is affordable for the end user. And it's putting a real stranglehold on new development. So I just wanted to highlight this because when we're looking at long-term supply, all of these things play a cumulative effect on impacting what an end user must pay.
It's funny how you sort of say, the federal government are saying, we've got this ambitious target to build all these new homes. I mean, my argument was over before it even started. Like the target was way too high given what we've got going on. And look at this. They're trying to push construction, but on the back end, they're actually putting these hurdles in front of people. And I really think the state governments are so drunk on these property taxes that it needs to get out of the way to be able to make a meaningful change to housing supply, right? But yet we've got this economic summit that's talking about, negative gearing is the issue. I would argue that this is 100x a bigger issue than negative gearing when it comes to housing affordability.
And I think the biggest concern is that the end consumer really doesn't know that this is happening. Because these taxes are all hidden taxes and they're absorbed into development costs. And so the end user, which is the property buyer, ultimately just thinks developers are getting greedier and increasing their margins. In actual fact, as a property developer myself, the margins to bring a development or a dwelling to the market, whether that's in the low density, medium density or high density space, have really shrunk in the last 5 to 8 years. And, because taxation has increased, the cost of purchasing the land has increased because property values have escalated so rapidly in the last 5 to 10 years here in Brisbane. These all add to development costs. And of course, now we're in a higher interest rate environment than we were post-COVID. So it's not feasible for a lot of developers to actually build the end product that we need more of, and especially in the medium and high density space here in Brisbane. Back in 2017, we had so many cranes in the sky and we were building more than we needed. But right now there's no cranes because developers simply can't sell the end product for the price that they need, not only to cover their costs, but also to make a margin.
And it is a risky type of business too. So the margin has to be there. And if they're only getting a 7% return, it's not going to happen. That's
right. And I don't have a slide for this, but I'll also mention briefly that another reason that developers were able to bring a lot of product to the market back in 2017 is we had different foreign investor regulations at that time. Those regulations have changed. So a lot of foreigners were able to buy off the plan apartments. And of course, a lot of the larger developers, a lot of developers need a certain proportion of their units or townhouses to be pre-sold off the plan before they actually get the funding to complete the project. So without that segment of the market being foreign buyers who were driving a lot of those pre-sales, it's really slowed down. And this is also aligned with warnings from some terrible construction practices, for example, down in Sydney with the Opal Towers. So consumers are genuinely more concerned about the impacts of buying off the plan. So it's really slowed down that segment of the market as well.
Absolutely. And being heavily reflected in our own data as well. New properties, I think, peaked over 40% of all the transactions that we're doing, whereas now I think it's less than 10%. And we are kind of a little bit more weighted to the new construction because the depreciation deductions are better. So it's a weird sample size, but it's clear to see just with our own kind of metrics, it's fallen off a cliff in terms of the amount of transactions that are on new property.
Absolutely. So I do want to say that we can project forward to see, well, what is Southeast Queensland and what is Brisbane likely to look like in the future? Historically, and I'm a Brisbane girl, I have lived in Brisbane my entire life. So I've really seen Brisbane grow up from what we used to call it a country town into the big city that it has become. But it's not over yet and we've got a long way to go. And what I will say to people is that what Brisbane will look like 10 or 15 years from now is going to be quite different to what Brisbane looks like today. And this slide really tells a story about why that is the case. So this is actually breaking down the types of dwellings that will be constructed in the future. Now, typically and historically, Brisbane is and has been a low-density city. Most people love the fact that Brisbane residents enjoy large blocks of land, large homes, and a big backyard. That has been changing in recent years and it will continue to change. And one thing that is very prevalent is that it can't change everywhere because we also have some significant heritage overlays and character overlays that protect demolition on some property types. So it's about understanding where those areas might sit and then also understanding where the future supply is likely to be delivered. So this slide shows where is the new dwelling growth coming from and what is the composition of that new dwelling growth likely to look like. And this is all hypothetical. It's all from Shaping Southeast Queensland, which is our regional planning scheme set by the state government. You can see that detached housing between 2021 and 2046, the total volume of detached housing is likely to shrink from 69% of total dwelling supply back down to 58%. So there's a clear intent to create a more dense style of dwellings across Brisbane, and this is through all council regions. And we're going to get down to a local government area mix for dwelling types on future slides. You can see low-rise attached dwellings. Councils and governments are really trying to promote this product type. Not a lot of change in the medium rise, but a big shift up there in the high rise attached dwellings again. And so you can see that total composition of where the new dwelling growth is likely to come from. Still 40% in detached housing. So for any investors that are looking for house on land, it's really important to know, well, where is the new land that's developable and has access to services? Where is that likely to be? Because you don't want to necessarily be buying in an area where there's an abundance of new supply around you if you're looking for that price pressure long term. 29% low-rise attached dwellings. It's important to understand where they can be built and where they can't be built based on land zoning and also any character protections that are in place. 10% medium rise, that's a much smaller portion, but 21% high rise attached. It's really important for buyers to understand how this may impact certain suburbs and certain property types in and around those suburbs into the future.
That's a very interesting insight into the future of Brisbane. Obviously, we'll get to the population point of things a little bit later, but there's people coming. They need to be housed, right? And
that's right. Yeah.
This is, these are forecasts that are existing in a period of headwinds for developers. I think a couple of interest rate cuts will kind of help, but the tax impost again, it makes it tricky for developers.
The Give for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Absolutely. And also, let's not forget the infrastructure that we need to build to deliver the 2032 Olympic Games. And so construction workers are going to be, in high demand for these big government projects. So therefore, we need to consider, well, what do we need to pay construction workers to continue to deliver the dwellings that we need? Because they're going to be lured to some of the big commercial projects and infrastructure projects that we need to build as well. And there in itself is another dilemma that we face here in Brisbane.
I remember hearing Sam, the CEO of OpenAI, sort of talking about the future of work, and his advice was to become a plumber because AI can't deal with pipes and all of the things that we need with infrastructure. So it's probably going to be a good time for tradies in the next little while. And there is a shortage of tradies, and that's something that we need to invest in, right?
That's right. I got 3 boys of my own. I said, be a plumber or be an electrician. So one of the two, I think they'll do very well if that's the career path they choose. And no one wants to follow their mother's advice, so none of them are going that way at this point in time. So let's move on to the next slide, because this actually tells us a little bit more about what do we mean by these various types of or various categories of future dwelling supply. So detached dwellings, they're 1 to 3 stories, but it's simply a home on a freehold lot. Low rise is 1 to 3 stories, but it's attached. So here in Brisbane, typically we call a lot of these townhouses. I know in other capital city markets, they're called row houses. Medium rise is 4 to 8 stories. This has been an area that we're not going to see as much development in. It's sort of the missing middle that a lot of people talk about. But based on the Southeast or the Shaping Southeast Queensland plan, there really is not enough coming of this product type. So again, just thinking about that from an investment perspective, what is the demand going to look like in the future if we're not building enough of this product? And then, of course, high rise, we can see a large portion of new dwellings will come in high rise construction. And we've talked about the challenges of delivering some of these high rise constructions to the market right now based on the cost to construct. And there's a big difference between the established price of some of these products versus the new price. And until we see some sort of, gap closure, it's likely that those products will be held off. A lot of the high density properties that are being constructed right now are really appealing to that prestige market, that downsizer market, people who will pay a premium for that end product, and developers are really targeting that market for this construction type.
That's an interesting point, because if we go back to the slide about the cost to bring a greenfield house and land online in Brisbane, it was about $830 or thereabouts. not a million miles away from the median house price. And I suppose if you allow for the fact that Greenfield is not likely to be very close to the CBD and allow for the fact that there's maybe a 150 grand difference there, new property isn't cheap at the moment. It kind of feels like we need to get to the point where I could buy this established place, or I can go, 5Ks further and get a brand new property for a little bit cheaper. Until that happens, we're probably not going to see a boom in construction, would you say?
Yeah, look, I tend to agree with that perspective. I think also a lot of our detached dwellings, when we see new estates now, we're seeing land size shrink. So what you may be able to buy an established property for, you might get double the land size, but a slightly older dwelling for the same price as you would a brand new dwelling on a much smaller block of land. So that land to asset ratio is shrinking because the cost of construction is increasing. So again, for the end consumer, it's just understanding, what does that mean, especially if you are a property investor, if you're spending a lot more on the depreciating part of the asset. And I know that's great for MCG quantity surveying for, the depreciation benefits, of course. It's just really important for investors to understand that mix and how that might impact their long-term performance, especially if they're looking for a high growth strategy.
Yeah, it's a good point. But I suppose personally, I would rather people buy an appreciating asset than one that is jam-packed full of depreciation deductions.
Absolutely.
I think we can agree on that.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at the dwelling types within each local government area within Greater Brisbane, because I think this tells another story. And this is really important for people, especially property investors that may be looking to position in certain LGAs around Greater Brisbane. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone that within the Brisbane City Council region, and remember the Brisbane City Council region is the largest local government area across all of Australia. It's huge. In terms of geographical spread, it's between sort of 20 and 30 kilometres in every direction from the Brisbane CBD. So we're talking a lot of locations, a lot of suburbs within this footprint. So you can see there between 2021 and 2046, the shift in where new dwellings are likely to come. And the majority of dwellings here in Brisbane, to some people's surprise, is not going to be that high density dwelling. It's actually the low rise attached dwelling. And then medium rise as well. Obviously, there's a large portion of high rise. But infill development in terms of detached dwellings, most of the Brisbane land is already accounted for. There's very small pockets to the south down near Rochdale that of land that's still available. When you look on Google Maps and you look at the satellite imagery, you may see land, but a lot of that land is not developable or it's flood impacted land. So it's really important for people to get an understanding of what can be developed and what cannot. So that's not a surprise, because we feel that obviously closer to the CBD and closer to the city centre, we're likely to see higher density development take place. However, we also need to overlay these projections with local government planning schemes and local council overlays, because not all locations can achieve the outcome based on certain restrictions in terms of land zoning and also character protection, especially here in Brisbane. So it's an interesting observation to look at that and say, okay, well, there's going to be more high density development in the Brisbane City Council local government area. But we know, based on our understanding of the Brisbane City Council planning scheme, that there's several areas that are very close to the CBD that have a lot of character protection in place where they simply cannot build more high density, medium density or low rise attached dwellings. So it's going to be outside of these areas where a lot of these dwellings are likely to be delivered.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there are a lot of character places there, which I suppose are the enemy to new construction. But without those, we lose, I suppose, what makes Brisbane beautiful in some respects, the streetscape, right?
That's right. That's one of the reasons people love Brisbane. I know a lot of our interstate investors tell me they don't want a wooden house or they don't want a tin and timber house. And I said, well, that may restrict the areas that we can buy, especially if you're working with a premium budget to buy an investment property, because most of our inner city locations will be tin and timber. They will be character Queenslander homes. And interestingly, most character Queenslander homes have been built out of hardwood. So they're actually less prone to termite damage, as opposed to a lot of our brick homes, which are brick veneer homes, built with the not with hardwood, the pine, treated pine frames, and they're actually more susceptible to termite damage. So, we've seen through hundreds of property transactions, those that you think are less susceptible end up being the ones with problems.
There you go.
There you go. Okay, let's look at Ipswich. So you can see there with Ipswich and also Logan, very similar trends. Most new dwellings between now and 2046 will be in the detached housing space. So these are land subdivisions. We know, based on South East Queensland Regional Plan, that the majority of South East Queensland's future land supply is within these two council regions, Ipswich and Logan. So this is not a surprise to us that this is where the developable land sits, and so therefore this is where we're going to expand our footprint in terms of the detached dwellings or single homes on their own lots. There's also going to be a smaller portion of the low-rise attached dwellings, but you can see there high-rise and medium-rise really not something that is a focus for either of these city council regions. So if you're looking at that type of product in these areas and it's already there, it's not likely that there's going to be much more future supply of that in the future.
Mm.
The last two council regions on the next slide are Moreton and Redlands. So you can see here with Moreton Bay, we're already seeing evidence of Moreton Bay constructing some of these low-rise attached dwellings, and you can see a huge portion of the new dwelling growth is going to be in this segment of the market. A slightly smaller portion will be the detached housing, and there's a slightly larger portion than Ipswich and Logan coming through in the high-rise attached and also the medium-rise attached. But the predominant property types here are, as you can see there, low-rise and fully detached dwellings. Redlands, we're going to see a little bit more of that medium density development. And in fact, in this segment of the market close to the bay, we're going to see that as an opportunity for developers to, deliver this type of product to the market. Again, the demographic of who lives in some of these locations can often determine the uptake of these dwellings as well. The Bayside locations do have a high portion of retirees that relocate for that way of living. So, that also appeals to the demographic who live in some of these locations as well.
That makes sense.
If we just move on, that probably sort of covers what's coming and where it's coming. And I think for anyone that's listening, it's also important, as I've said, to just understand what's developable in these areas and what's not, because that's going to give you an understanding of what competing supply there may be for the product type that you're buying as a property investor. So look at that. We've covered the supply side, and we've only got 20 minutes left and we haven't even touched on demand. But I think the supply is something that is much harder to change. So demand seems to jump around depending on economic conditions, interest rates, population movements. I will run through some of these demand drivers now just to give people an understanding of what is driving the demand here in Brisbane right now. The first thing I've got there is in relation to property transaction costs. So if we look at stamp duty and we look at on a national scale in terms of the proportion that or the amount that people have to pay towards stamp duty in different states, and I think this is the reason why Queensland has consistently been one of the top picks for property investors. You can see that we have a much lower amount payable for stamp duty based on our median value or median property price for a house. And I think that's potentially why people are more attracted to Brisbane or Queensland as a whole as an investment location. The cost burden is not as high as it is elsewhere. So perhaps this is one reason why we are seeing some demand shift towards Queensland, especially for people that might be rent investors in other capital city markets, can't afford to buy their home in these markets, and therefore they're looking to place their money in a market that's going to deliver on the growth targets or yields targets that they're looking for. We go
it's
to the
very meaningful difference, isn't it? I was quite surprised to see this slide, and my mind is kind of bent on first home buyers at the moment because of the removal of the caps. Normally we have 40,000 places for first home buyer grants. You'll know better than me when that is happening. I think it starts maybe October. There's about 134,000 first home buyer transactions every year. That number is probably, you would say, like to increase if only 40,000 are getting this little grant here. So to me, it seems intuitive that it'll amplify that differential, and Brisbane should be a beneficiary of that. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I don't disagree. And, the other thing I'll say is this is looking at median house values. Right now in Brisbane, the median unit value for an attached dwelling is sitting around $720,000. Noting that for first home buyers, a lot of stamp duty concessions are available up to $700,000 in Brisbane. So one of the reasons that the unit market, which we'll get to, has been outperforming the house market in Brisbane, which is in stark contrast and opposite to many other markets around Australia, I think is for affordability and the stamp duty concessions that apply more to units and townhouses than they do to houses, simply because of median value differentiation. So it's an interesting observation. Let's go to the next slide. So interstate migration. Look, this has been a story of many years off the back of COVID. If we go to the slide that actually shows the trends in terms of where people are moving to, we know New South Wales and Victoria continue to attract the bulk of our international or overseas migrants, but Brisbane absolutely leads the nation in terms of net interstate migration. Let's face it, everyone wants to get a piece of Southeast Queensland. People that were locked down in some southern states really wanted a lifestyle shift. We've seen that in our own evidence through inquiries peaking, people relocating. There's lifestyle appeal. There's relative affordability. So even though Brisbane's median value is higher than Melbourne's right now, what you get for the amount of money you have to spend is still more than what you get in Melbourne, because we have larger houses and larger backyards. And so for all of these reasons, people have been attracted, and we've seen more shifting to Southeast Queensland. And we've certainly seen that in terms of our vacancy rate tightening and that demand from buyers in the market as well. So this is an ongoing story, and it's not slowing down at this point in time.
It's interesting, isn't it? The media typically will just focus on interstate arrivals. So we know that Sydney's more popular than Brisbane, for example, but it's not about necessarily who comes in and where they go. It's like, where do people leave from that state as well? And Queensland, I mean, we both spent a week in Melbourne last week, and there's some big differences between the two places. Melbourne is beautiful, but the weather is a big draw card, and what you get for the money, of course, as well. Absolutely.
So if we go through to the next slide, then we've got growth projections. So again, we're back to shaping Southeast Queensland. This is our state government plan. So over the last 20 years, we saw about 66,800 people move to Queensland. That was our population growth, not just move, but through natural births, overseas migration and interstate migration. Up to 2046, we're expecting a further 86,400 people per annum. Okay, so our population is projected to be 5.94 million between now and 2046, which is a huge shift from where it is today. If we just go to the next slide, it'll also show us where the demographic shifts are coming, because the population composition is also changing. So right now, we've got only 15.9% of people aged over 65 years, but by 2046, that will increase to just under 20%. We need to think about what housing these people want to live in, and this is what we should be building, or this is what we potentially could be investing in to ensure that we maintain that high demand for that property long term. When we look at the number of children, right now, 22.6, there's going to be fewer young children between the ages of 0 and 17 by 2046. So again, these are population shifts that will influence the type of housing that might be in demand in the future. Single person households, you can see that there's a huge increase in what is projected in terms of those living alone. Again, how does this change what demand will look like in the future? And this is what we need to be thinking about as property investors, if we're wanting something that's in demand when we choose to sell, or when we're wanting to rely on the income that it's going to generate.
That's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, we need our household formation rates to continue their little uptick. What are we, 2.6, 2.8 or something like that? But, a dwelling for every individual places way more pressure on the construction side of things, which is already struggling.
Absolutely. And so we can also look at, with the next slide, how is the population going to be distributed throughout Southeast Queensland? And you can see there we've really broken it down into each local government area. Brisbane local government area is likely to experience the highest portion of population growth. So we've just seen on previous slides, we can't really build more single dwellings on their own lot. So the demand is likely to shift into the higher density space. And you can see there Gold Coast. I haven't covered Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast in other parts of this presentation, but Ipswich, Logan, Moreton Bay and Redlands I have, and you can see there the population projections across all of these areas of Greater Brisbane is very strong.
Mm.
Okay, moving on.
I'm just squinting my eyes. Yeah, there's some very interesting stories there. And if you're wanting a copy of this presentation before anybody asks, it'll be sent through to you in 24 hours automatically as well, so you'll be able to pore over this at your leisure.
Enjoy all of the information we've pulled together. Okay, obviously interest rates, we should hear later today what's happening in terms of this month's interest rate movements. They're likely to fall. Some are predicting a higher fall than others. But when we look historically on the next slide at what's happened to interest rates, obviously a lot of people have been talking about this huge growth in markets post-COVID. And, you know, regardless of where you've purchased or what you've purchased, really, you've probably done well in property since COVID. And this is because money was almost free. We had interest rates at the lowest level historically that they've ever been. And of course, when interest rates started to escalate, people started to panic. We certainly didn't see a sell-off in housing as some predicted. Here in Brisbane, we did have a lot of uncertainty, more so driven by consumer sentiment than actual changes in property values on the ground. But since that cash rate has stabilised, we've also seen that demand shift. So the interest rates can have a huge impact on consumer sentiment more than anything else, and that impacts on the demand side of things. But that's usually a very short-term change. As we experienced when interest rates went up, Brisbane median values fell. As soon as the cash rate stabilised, Brisbane's median values started to escalate rapidly once again. So consumer sentiment can really be impacted by changes in interest rates, and we expect that more confidence will come back into the market yet again if interest rates are indeed cut later this afternoon.
Let's hope so. And go swing for the fence. So it's been a while since we've had a 50 basis pointer. I think we're due.
Well, it's likely, but let's see what they do. Lending data also remains elevated. So when we look at Queensland, we can see that there's the trend line in terms of the volume of loans, new housing finance commitments that are being made here in Queensland. It's really strong, and it's certainly increased again. You can see what happened when interest rates were increasing. We saw lending or housing finance commitments reduce. Now that interest rates have stabilised, they've picked back up again. So again, consumer sentiment can really impact on the ability for someone to go out and get a loan. So this is an indicator of intent to buy. Okay, so obviously housing demand also can be influenced by the local economy, and I've got some information here from the latest CommSec State of the States report. Queensland is the third strongest economy nationwide. So this is just the July data. And you can see there the strength is housing finance, and this is quite relevant to the housing market, where our weaknesses lie in equipment spending. And so, again, we need to relate from this report what's relevant to housing and sustainability in the housing market, and Queensland's ranking very highly in that particular indicator at this point in time.
Surprising to see Victoria with only a 4 as well. There's been a lot of talk about the basket case economy down there.
It has. Okay, and investor sentiment, that obviously remains high here in Brisbane as well. I've just captured some results from a couple of recent surveys. First is the Pippa Investment Survey report from 2024. Respondents to this particular survey indicated that Brisbane was one of the highest ranked locations in terms of where they purchased in the last 12 months. 24% of respondents had purchased in Brisbane. If we move to the next slide, we can also see that the 18% of people were still indicating that Brisbane is the best place to invest right now. So You can see there Perth was ahead, so was Melbourne, but Brisbane was third in line behind those two cities. So this is intent to buy. This is from property investors, and it gives us an understanding that demand is still strong for properties in Brisbane for investors that may be located anywhere across the country. We've got another survey here, which is the Australian Property Investor Property Sentiment Report from Q1 2025. And the question was, which state or territory do you regard as having the best property investment prospects for the next 12 months? You can see there Queensland, 35% of respondents indicated Queensland was the best pick, which is interesting because the PIPA survey showed Perth and Melbourne as being ahead of Brisbane. So perhaps this is an indication that people are looking regionally as well as the capital city market, but this is also more recent data. So perhaps sentiment has shifted between when the PIPA survey was completed and when this was completed a few months later.
Yeah, it is funny. You've got some real powerhouse regions in Queensland as well. Like
yes.
Toowoomba's been doing very well. Townsville, I think, topped the nation from an SA3 point of view in calendar year 2024, and a couple of other, places like Bundaberg and Mackay, and we won't go into those particular markets, but yeah, it's a big state you've got up there.
It is, it certainly is. And we can't underestimate the fact that a lot of people are looking outside of the capital cities themselves. This is also API historical sentiment reports. Queensland's always been a hot pick for property investors. And again, perhaps for those reasons relating to stamp duty, affordability, we historically have had higher yields than a lot of other markets as well. And this is why it has remained an investor hotspot from 2024 right through to 2025.
So if anyone can't see, it sort of goes left to right in terms of historical back to today. I say historical, we're still talking 2024.
Yeah.
Queensland, that shape is saying that it's getting hotter. So yeah, very interesting to see there.
Super interesting. Okay, so let's do a current market update to help people understand what's happening right now in Brisbane. And I will rush through this because I'd love to leave some time for questions. So the auction clearance rates are increasing month on month, perhaps due to strong buyer sentiment, but also due to the fact that sellers are more willing to meet the market. Days on market are currently 25 days. That's actually increased. It was 16 days 12 months ago. We are seeing some segments of the market, especially high-end properties, they're taking longer to sell. We're also now seeing with the introduction of the new seller disclosure regime that anything that requires a body corporate disclosure, there's a bit of a backlog in preparing contracts here in Queensland, and that will also slow down days on market. We expect the days on market to blow out a little bit. And again, it's understanding why the data might be telling something based on what's happening on the ground.
That's a very good point. Without the local knowledge, you would look at it and say, oh, the market's getting softer.
That's right.
But there's nuances.
There certainly is. Sorry about the formatting then. Dwelling values have increased in Brisbane. So this is totality data. So monthly up to the end of July, 0.7% increase. You can see how that compares to every other capital city market. The next slide, I've got PropTrack data, which also shows that Brisbane has increased 0.4% over the last month. So the same monthly trend. Just keep in mind these research houses are using slightly different analysis to create their monthly growth index, I guess you could say, but they all should be showing the same trend effectively. I prefer to look at property like segmentation by house and unit market, especially when we look at this particular graph. So this is property price segmentation, but this is dwellings values. So here in Brisbane, you can see that the more affordable end of the market has shifted 2.7% in the 3 months to June. They are properties that are in the lowest 25% of property values. So if you rank every property sale from the lowest to the highest and you take the bottom 25%, that segment of the market has grown at a faster rate. The top segment of the market, the top 25%, they've grown 1.7%. But this is dwellings data. And as you'll see on the next couple of slides, the unit market has outperformed the housing market significantly. And because of that, we're seeing more units in that lower segment of the dwellings data. So this is totality data for houses. In July, 0.7% increase in house price growth. Quarterly, we're sitting at 2.1%, annually at 6.7%. I've got some visuals that are a bit easier to look at rather than the tables, so we'll keep flicking through this because I am conscious of time. The prop track data also shows house values have increased. And unit values. So we talked about the difference between house values and unit values. So you can see there, unit values up 1.1% for the month, house values were 0.7%. Annually, unit values up 10.6%, whereas house values are up 6.7%. So there's a big shift in the annual change of values across different segments of the market.
That is very interesting to observe, that one.
Prop track also shows a price growth of 0.5% in the unit market throughout July as well. So the same positive growth trend. This is an interesting graph. So here we're looking at the dark bars being house value changes on a month-by-month basis, and the unit market is represented by the light blue bars. Really trying to highlight what's actually happened in the last 18 months to 2 years in the unit market. A lot of that's driven by affordability, but you can see that month-on-month price growth has been higher consistently than the housing market. A lot of that is perhaps due to the incentives for first home buyers, affordability challenges, and perhaps a change in the way people are wanting to live. Let's actually move on to 12-month value changes. So here we've segregated the information into house data and unit data. So you can see there at a national level, Brisbane's second highest performer in terms of unit price growth, and on par with a couple of other locations for the second highest growth in terms of 12-month value changes for houses. And then if we look at the 3-month value changes, it is a story of Darwin when we're looking at the quarterly figures, absolutely. But you can see there Brisbane not far behind that unit market, continuing to outperform the housing market. But in terms of the other large capital city markets, still well ahead of Melbourne and Sydney.
And it's not something that we're used to seeing units outperform houses. I think we've got to the point where we're at that kind of peak delta in the cycle where the house values and the unit values are quite a ways apart, and the rubber band can only be sort of stretched for so long.
Well, you'll see there also at a national level, Brisbane's bucking the trend in terms of the unit price changes being ahead of house price changes, because for most other capital cities, I think besides Adelaide, it's the house market that's outperforming.
There you go.
So rental market, it's tight. Vacancy rates are sitting at 0.9% month on month. You can see what happened in 2017. We had escalated vacancy since then. The number of properties available to rent has been declining, and we simply now haven't built enough properties, and we haven't provided enough properties to the market to keep up with the demand that exists for, these types of homes. So this is what's putting upward pressure on rents. And you can see here vacancy rates at different suburb levels are not the same. So I've just selected two here. The one on the left, vacancy rate is actually sitting above 3%. The one on the right, vacancy rate sitting above about 1.6%. So it's really important to get an understanding. I may have that around the wrong way because I can't see the numbers. It's important to get an understanding at a local level, because what's happening citywide might not be relevant to the suburb that you're buying. So I'd always recommend for people to look at vacancy rates so that they can understand how quickly they're likely to obtain or find a tenant. Rent price growth, it's increasing again. So Brisbane's experienced 4.3% annual change in house rents and 5.6% annual change in unit rents. That's actually been growing progressively over the last 3 months as well. So we're starting to see a re-acceleration in those unit and house rents.
Yeah, which is interesting when you've got quite a number of markets that are on the decline, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that for many markets, affordability is putting a real cap on what tenants can pay. So again, understanding local market demographics and affordability criteria can make a big impact or in terms of long-term performance of the asset that you're choosing.
Yeah, absolutely.
How are we going for time? Because I'm conscious that we're approaching 11 o'clock. There's a couple of additional things I'll run through. Are we still okay to keep going?
Yeah, look, I think that's okay. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I want to let those guys know we will come back to that. But the content is so good. I appreciate you putting it together. Let's charge through. I don't want to leave anything out.
All good. So we've talked about affordability challenges, and what I wanted to highlight here is that in some areas you'll find that affordability is not an issue because the weekly family income is growing at a much faster rate than the state average in some postcodes, and therefore the amount of or the proportion of mortgage repayments as a percentage of total household income before tax still sits at affordable levels. But if you switch over to the next graph, there are some postcodes where this is very different. Weekly family incomes are not really growing much at a rate that's much more than the Queensland state average as a whole. And remember, in Brisbane, property prices have escalated rapidly. And so from the most recent data collected at the 2021 census, there are some areas in Brisbane that were already challenged in terms of affordability. That is, more than 30% of take-home income was being allocated towards mortgage repayments. Obviously, since then, we've had an escalation of interest rates and property prices have also escalated rapidly. So we're looking forward to seeing the updated data once we do the next census, because I think we're going to see more and more suburbs fall into the levels that we would consider being completely unaffordable for locals.
Yeah, and that puts a real kind of blanket on the potential upside, right?
100%. And for those that are still here and have been waiting for some insights on the Olympics, this is just something that I'd like to say as a general comment. The Brisbane Olympic Games in 2032 are an Olympic Games like no other modern Olympic Games. Our Olympic Games are being delivered within a 5-kilometre radius of the Brisbane CBD. We all know in Sydney, land was dedicated at Homebush to create a precinct. In Brisbane, the land that has been dedicated for the major Olympic stadium, the swimming complex, and a lot of the events is on the fringe of the CBD. So this is just a map of the Victoria Park precinct. It's how that sits relative to other existing infrastructure that's already in place. And we need to think about the Brisbane Olympics in a different way to the way we've thought about Olympics in the past. If we just go to the next slide, it just shows an image of how close the Brisbane main stadiums and the main events are to the CBD. And this is something that I've been talking about for many years since it was announced that Brisbane was going to have the Olympics. I know there was a lot of change in terms of where's the main stadium going to be. It was going to be at Wollongabba. Now it's confirmed it's going to be at Victoria Park. But we need to think about accessibility. We need to think about transport options, and we need to think about what infrastructure is being built and where, and how is this going to impact the property market for all of Greater Brisbane? Because I don't think it's going to have the same effect citywide as it will in some specific precincts. If we just move to a Google map, so you can see there the big red star. This is the main stadium in Victoria Park, and the brown stars are just some of the other larger venues that are being upgraded or used within the inner city Olympic Games village. Now, of course, we do know that the Olympic Games are going to be spread more widely across all of Queensland, but a lot of the big infrastructure spend is happening within this particular region that we've outlined here with these stars. So on the next slide, I just made some points. There's obviously huge infrastructure development that's coming into Southeast Queensland, and especially into these inner city locations in Brisbane. That's going to create jobs. It's going to create economic development. There's going to be a movement of construction workers away from the residential sector to infrastructure projects. To keep people in the residential sector, we may need to pay them more to attract them to continue to build that product type. So what does this mean for delivering on our housing targets? Other considerations are what will we have to build and where are we going to build it based on that Shaping Southeast Queensland plan and based on where people are likely to want to live for accessibility to some of the employment hubs, some of the lifestyle hubs, and, just the way we're going to be living in the future. I think commute times will become a much more important thing for people to consider, because our public transport systems here in Brisbane are quite underdeveloped compared to a lot of other capital city markets around Australia.
There's a lot of talk about unmanned aerial vehicles being the way that we'll get around for the Olympics. So, that could be a way to solve it.
Could be.
Who knows? Who knows?
Could be. And we've got a Brisbane Metro that's just being released. There's plans to extend that in various corridors throughout the city. So there's definitely plans in place to create more frequent public transport systems, but we've got quite an immature system right now. So just to summarise what we've covered today, Brisbane unit prices have actually outperformed the house prices in Brisbane for the last 12 to 18 months. The strongest growth in Brisbane has been in the lower value properties. Entry-level homes have been transacting faster than premium properties despite overall longer days on market. And listing volumes remain painstakingly low, well below long-term averages. And this is what is causing some of the lineups, like you can see in this slide. There's a lot of buyers that are frustrated. They've missed out multiple times. A lot of properties are transacting with multiple offers. And so, these are real concerns for the fundamentals that exist in our market right now.
Beautiful. But my number one thanks goes to you, Melinda. Thank you very much for putting all of that together and sharing what has been an action-packed 75 minutes of Brisbane-specific content. So hopefully that's really whet the appetite for people to do some more research if they are interested in purchasing the market, to potentially reach out to you and your team. But thank you very much for putting all of that together. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I hope it's added value. And I appreciate the opportunity to join you once again, Mike. So thank you.
Absolutely.